Well, hi there, everyone. It looks like we have made it back to the letter W. And this week I have decided that I was going to bring us a lesson about the writing on the wall. You know, in the Bible, we have many of these phrases that are in our English language that we use on a day-by-day basis. And many times we forget that these phrases and these stories come from the Bible. There are many of these things, like the writing on the wall that we're going to talk about today, but there are other ones like the fly in the ointment, or fall by the wayside, or feet of clay, or eat, drink, and be merry, which is a famous saying that a lot of people have on their dining room walls nowadays. A house divided cannot stand. Many of these types of sayings are available. So today we're going to talk about one of them, again, which I said was called the writing on the wall. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to take you back a little bit in order to set the stage for this. We had talked before about the history behind this. We have the nation of Israel here, and they were carried away in captivity over here to the area that we know of in Iraq, to a place that was called Babylon. So all of the Jews from here are all the way over here now, living included in the nation of Babylon. We're about 500 years before Christ. God used King Nebuchadnezzar to come against the nation of Israel and to capture the city and take the people away as slaves. It was a very sad, one of the most horrific events that happened in the history of Israel. In the process of doing that, the city of Jerusalem was burned, the Solomon's temple was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar's army took all the artifacts and the special cups and candelabras, menorahs, and things that were in the temple, and they carried all of those with them back to Babylon. So we begin in the book of Daniel, where this story comes. In chapter 2, it says, "In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, 'I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means.'" So King Nebuchadnezzar was distressed and couldn't remember the dream, and it soon became obvious that none of the king's advisors and wise men would be able to know what the dream was or how to interpret it. And King Nebuchadnezzar threatened to kill them all if they couldn't come up with the meaning of the dream. Daniel was included in that group. He asked for a little bit of special time, and overnight he prayed along with his two companions and asked that God reveal to him what the dream was and what the meaning was. So overnight, God did reveal to Daniel the dream and its meaning. When you study the Bible, one of the earliest things that you'll learn all the way back from Genesis is that God always tells us in advance what he's going to do. You know, people are sometimes shocked when these things happen, but if you're a Bible student, you can see that we were warned ahead of time of each of these things. God told Adam and Eve exactly what would happen if they disobeyed in the garden. Did he not? He told them if they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they would surely die. God told Abraham that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And the conversation with Abraham, God says, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do?" And he did not. He told Abraham that he was going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Old Testament is full of the prophets, all their writings, over and over again, warnings to Israel of what was going to happen if they did not repent of their idolatry. The prophets like Jonah. Jonah was sent to prophesy to Nineveh before it was destroyed. Isaiah, Amos, and the others, they all prophesied what God was going to do in advance. So this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is going to reveal in advance what's going to happen to the kingdoms of the earth. So Daniel went in to see the king in the morning, and as he says, "As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. So Daniel goes in the morning to see the king, and he reveals to Nebuchadnezzar that what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was, and Nebuchadnezzar indeed had dreamed of this large statue. We see in the corner there. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Now, we're not going to go into a full study today on the meaning of all that is involved in this statue, but I'm bringing it to your attention today because this sets the stage for what happens afterwards. This was the dream, Daniel says, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your majesty, you are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. And he did. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of Babylon was the highest civilization on the planet at that time. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. So what we have here in this statue are, this statue is set up in metals, meaning the head is gold, which is the most valuable. The arms and the chest are made of silver. Now we know silver is slightly less valuable than gold. The belly and thighs are made of bronze, again, less valuable than silver or gold. Finally, iron. The legs are made of iron. And each one of these metals is inferior to the one ahead of it. Silver is somewhat inferior to gold. Bronze is inferior to silver. So these metals and this statue is God's way of showing Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar that kingdoms were going to come into play that are going to take over the kingdom of Babylonia. This is where we are. The head of gold is the Babylonian Empire, which is where the Jews find themselves at this writing at about 500 years before Christ. What we're finding in this story is that the Medes and Persians, this empire, is going to come in and take over that one. God has revealed to Daniel that another empire would take over the Babylonian Empire, which is in modern day Iraq, in this area here. Saudi Arabia, Babylon, this area. This is where I showed you on the first map. But while these people are living and thinking that they are the only most important empire, over here is another empire that has also grown extremely large. This empire, which is the empire of the Medes and the Persians, is now going to come in and take over this empire and consume it in itself. So now the empire of the Medes and Persians will encompass this whole area, including Israel. That's what this statute is talking about, empires that come against the nation of Israel or the territory of Israel here. Okay? Daniel 2:21 says, and he, God, changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. These powers that are rising and falling, these kingdoms on the earth, are in God's hands. He's the one that raises up kings and raises up and then takes kings down and raises kings up. And you find that in the rise and fall of the civilizations of history that we have studied over the years. So Nebuchadnezzar finally, at the end of his life, passed away, And through much murder and intrigue, King Belshazzar, son of Nabonidus, became co-ruler over this kingdom. Co-ruler, because actually his father was the ruler, and his father was called away for a long period of time and left his son Nabonidus in charge of this area where around Babylon, where Daniel is. So history tells us that there were 5 steps between King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar, who may have actually been his grandson. We're not really sure, because in the ancient writings, they always call that person their father or their son, when actually there could be many steps in between. For example, in the New Testament, people called Jesus son of David, which he was, but he wasn't the immediate son of David. There were many generations between there. The Jews called themselves sons of Abraham, many generations in between. In this case, we think there was about 5. So 10 years have now gone by after Nebuchadnezzar's death, and Nabonidus has left his son in charge while he was elsewhere. Now, King Belshazzar's name means Bel, protect the king. And Bel was one of their pagan gods that the Babylonians worshipped. So his name means that it is expected that Bel will protect the king. Well, we know that doesn't happen. So in chapter 5, verse 1, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for thousands of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, where did we hear that before? I think when we just had our lesson with Queen Vashti, we found exactly the same thing, these gigantic banquets with all this drinking. So that's what King Belshazzar does. He throws himself an enormous banquet again with all of this drinking. Now, while they're drinking and partying, they are unaware that the Persians have surrounded their city. Remember that kingdom I told you far out to the right that's going to take over the kingdom of the Babylonians? Well, they're lying in wait, unaware. The partiers are unaware that there's an army very nearby. So while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Remember, we said when King Nebuchadnezzar came against the nation of Israel and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, they took the goblets with them, the drinking glasses, and all the important things. So now King Belshazzar brings out these items, these things taken from the temple, and he wants to drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And as they drank the wine, listen to this, as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. They're using these sacred objects from God, and they're praising idols with them. This is a serious offense to God. These sacred articles that were carefully made to God's specifications were sanctified as holy and were used by the priest in their daily service to God. So during the siege of Jerusalem, they were taken from Solomon's temple and carried off by Nebuchadnezzar's army. Now, Belshazzar brings them out and carelessly uses them in the praise of their own pagan idols. But suddenly, God does something completely spectacular. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Imagine you would be too if you saw this hand writing on a wall with no body attached to it. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around their neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." So Nabonidus is the 2nd highest ruler in the kingdom. Of course, his father is away, who is the main ruler. So he plans on giving this, anybody that can read this, he's going to give them this special place of authority. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed and don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." So this woman, this queen, sounds like to me that it might be the queen mother. It's hard to tell, but she's old enough to have knowledge, have history knowledge of who Daniel is in this kingdom. She calls this to remembrance. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, this is a word similar, not the same. The king we're talking about is Belshazzar. Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. He was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel. He will tell you what the writing means. Now, when Daniel was captured from Jerusalem and taken into Babylonia, the King Nebuchadnezzar gave them all Babylonian names. And I assumed that that was mostly to assimilate them into the culture, to make them appear more Babylonian and less Hebrew. But there are also some meanings to these Babylonian names. So Daniel's name as Belteshazzar, that means protect the life of the king. That's what Daniel's job was, to protect the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar's name means Bel will protect the king. See the little bit of difference there? Very ironic. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father brought from Judah?" And Daniel probably answered, "Yes. I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple," which means royalty, "and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, interesting about Daniel, we are inclined to think that God wanted his people to be separated from these cultures. But there are instances, I believe that that's true, but there are instances where God used certain people to infiltrate these cultures and be a spokesman for him to these rulers. And in this case, that's what Daniel is. I believe Daniel advanced through the ranks in the Babylonian culture to be in the right place at the right time to give this information to these rulers of what was about to happen. Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." Daniel's not out for personal gain. He doesn't want to be the third highest ruler in the land, and he doesn't want a purple robe, and he doesn't care about the chain around his neck. That's not his focus. So Daniel goes on and tells him, "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor." Remember, that was the head of gold on the statue that we talked about. This Nebuchadnezzar, that empire. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and people of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. And if you remember the story, God told Nebuchadnezzar that he was going to make him like an ox, that he would live outside, eat grass, And for 7 years, he would live outside as an animal. And that's exactly what happened. He became insane in this way. At the end of the 7 years, his sanity returned, and he was able to return to his throne. But at this point, Daniel was remembering this story to Belshazzar and reminding him of this. King Nebuchadnezzar was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he came back to his right mind, or when God returned it to him, he then gave great praise to God and said that he was the only God. In fact, there's a chapter in the Old Testament written by Nebuchadnezzar, a speech that he gave, which is very unusual. Usually it's God's prophets that are doing the writing, but Nebuchadnezzar's thoughts and his letter and his writing are there in the Old Testament. Daniel goes on and tells Belshazzar, "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this." Though you knew all this, Belshazzar, you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather. You saw what happened to him. You know that God in heaven is the one that did this. But you have not humbled yourself. So this is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was humbled to the point that he ate grass like an animal. And Daniel is reminding Belshazzar, you saw this happen. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And this is the inscription that was written. Daniel tells the king, Belshazzar, these are the words that were written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin is the word. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Those are the words that were written. And of course, nobody in Babylonia knew what they were. Daniel will explain what they were. Mene means to reckon or to sum up, to add up or take a reckoning of. Tekel means to weigh, as in scales, to weigh. Upharsin means divided, and it's the root word of the Hebrew word perez, upharsin. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. That's what was written. So Daniel says, here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Notice that it is past tense. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. It's over. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So Nebuchadnezzar, again, was the head of gold here. And this is where King Belshazzar is. He's part of the Babylonian Empire. But now what God is saying is, I have examined you and weighed you and found that you are not worth it, basically. You've been found wanting. And therefore now I'm going to allow this kingdom to come in and take over your kingdom. So now the empire of the Medes and the Persians will now take over. They're the arms of steel. Notice that Daniel says that God has divided Belshazzar's kingdom and given it to the Medes and Persians. Nothing has happened to Belshazzar yet God has pronounced this as being already accomplished. Belshazzar has no clue how swiftly things are going to change. So the handwriting on the wall announced what was going to happen as if it was a foregone conclusion and already has happened, even though it had not happened yet to Belshazzar. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom, which he didn't ask for. But Look how quickly this happens. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62 in one night. After the handwriting on the wall that afternoon, that very night, Belshazzar was slain. So, how did this happen? Well, Babylon was a city that was highly fortified, just like all of these ancient cities. The city had huge walls around it, impregnable walls. But according to extra biblical records, how it happened was the Persians were able to divert the Euphrates River, which ran through the city. They diverted the water supply further upstream. So as that was choked off, the river that was running through Babylon, the water level went down. And they left it go all the way down. And the Babylonians are partying. They're not paying any attention. And at night, the Persian army sneaks in on that riverbed and effectively comes into the city under the gates and through any openings where the river was, because the river supplied water throughout the city. There were openings under the gates and things. So the army was able to sneak in under the gates. So most likely, Belshazzar probably perished in the palace skirmish that night, and the city was taken without a fight. So where were the guards, right? Where were the guards and the watchmen on the wall? Why didn't they sound the alarm and blow the trumpet and didn't they see the army coming? Apparently not. They had no idea that this was happening. And the city fell. They captured the king and got the city all in one night without a fight. So here's an idea of what we're talking about. The water level was usually up here, so they let the water level go down so that they could come across the water up the steps and in the gates. And they apparently weren't manned. So that's the end of the story of what was the writing on the wall. And we have these events in our life where we could look at that and say, wow, the writing was on the wall with that. Why didn't I pay attention? These are warnings that we have in life that God gives us sometimes. Sometimes older folks or our parents can see the writing on the wall about something that's happened and they warn us. But as young people, sometimes we didn't listen. I often think about my mother and some of the things she told me. I'm thinking, wow, Mom, you were right. You were right. She saw the writing on the wall where I did not. So each time that these prophecies are shown to be fulfilled, it increases our hope and faith in future prophecies being also fulfilled. That statue that I showed you, those other civilizations did indeed capture those lands. The Romans did overrun the Greeks. The Greeks had overrun the Medes and Persians. The Medes and Persians had overrun the Babylonians. The Babylonians had overrun the nation of Israel. So these things did come to happen. And God did warn them that it was going to happen. We have had these prophecies of Daniel now for 3,000 years. And there are other prophecies of Daniel that talk to us about future events that still have not yet happened. And as we believe that these things happened that Daniel prophesied, we are led then to believe that these future events that are prophesied will happen. So we have to study prophecy. When you study prophecy in the Bible, it's there for several reasons. It's there to give you hope that God has already told you what's going to happen. Jesus said, I'm telling you these things in advance so that you'll remember that I told you that these things have to come to happen. But don't be troubled. I have overcome the world. That's what these are there for. So where are we today? Well, we are waiting for Jesus to come back. We are awaiting the second coming. We are awaiting all of these prophecies to be fulfilled. We are waiting for Jesus to come back and establish his millennial kingdom. We are waiting for him to do away with Satan so that he can't tempt us and hurt us anymore. We have all of these things to look forward to, and we can have confidence that if the things that were prophesied already in the Bible came true, that these things also will come true. Okay? So when you hear some of these sayings in our English language, think about them for a little bit and smile to yourself and say, yep, that's in the Bible. The writings on the wall. Other ones, fall by the wayside, a house divided, feet of clay. You know, some of those other ones, I wrote a couple of them down. The land of milk and honey. You've heard a lot of them. Just smile to yourself and say, yeah, I know that story. I know where that came from. Okay? So next week we are up to the letter X. We have X, Y, and Z. I've almost made it to the end of the alphabet. And there were times when I wasn't sure I could even think of anything. And I'm still struggling a little bit with X, but I think I'll have it figured out by next week. Okay? So let's close today's little session with a moment of prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for our Bible. Thank you that you have preserved these writings for us so that we could see that even in that time, 3,000 years ago, your prophet Daniel wrote. You gave him visions and he wrote down things that were going to happen. And we have these writings so that we can see as they begin to unfold in our lifetime, we can see your hand at work. Thank you for this, oh Lord, because it gives us confidence that you are still in control, even when things seem shaky, as we're still going through the effects of this terrible pandemic. And sometimes, Lord, we are anxious and troubled, and we need comfort from you to know that all these things must come to pass, but your will still be done and the best is yet to be. We ask, Lord, for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, friends, so I'll see you again next session, next week, and we'll deal with the letter X, okay? So in the meantime, have a great week. Bye now.